Bernice Talaferro here with Order Steps Life Coaching, and welcome back to the Psalm 42 Gathering Place. Grab your coffee or tea and find your seat, because tonight I want to tell you a story. It starts with a decision made outside of what God instructed, and yet God still provided. Now, what do you do with that? How do you hold the truth that something wasn't done according to His instruction, and at the same time recognize that His hand was still present? We're still in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, and we're introduced to a woman named Naomi. And the Bible says in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And now we already know what that means. That was a time of instability, confusion, and people doing what was right in their own eyes. And on top of that, there was a famine. So Naomi, her husband, and her 2 sons made a decision. They left Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem means house of bread. So they left the place that represented provision because it didn't look like it was provided. And they went to Moab. See, Moab wasn't just another city. It was a place where people did not worship God. And if you go back and look in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3 through 6, you'll see there was clear instructions from God about separating themselves from the Moabites because of the history with God's people. So this wasn't just a move. This was a decision outside of what God had instructed. And yet, God still allowed life to continue. They survived the famine. They established relationships because the sons married Orpah and Ruth and found some form of stability, which means that even in places that weren't perfectly aligned, God's grace was still present. And that's the part we don't talk about. We'll point out the decision, but we miss the mercy. And at Psalm 42 Gathering Place, we deal in truth and grace. We don't ignore the decision, but we also don't ignore the mercy, because the same God who gives instruction is the same God who will meet you when you don't completely follow them. But then everything starts to fall apart. Naomi's husband dies. Her 2 sons die. And now we have to understand something. This isn't just grief. This is survival. Because in that time, a woman's security was tied to the men in her life. Her husband, her sons, that was her covering, her provision, her stability. So when Naomi loses her husband and both her sons, she's not just heartbroken. She's vulnerable. She didn't just lose people. She lost her source of covering, her means of provision, and the structure that sustained her very life. Which means overnight, everything that once held her up was gone. Some of you know what that feels like. When life doesn't just hurt you, it removes what you were dependent on. When life doesn't just pain you, it shifts your entire foundation. So now we meet Naomi, not as a woman who just had a bad season, but as a woman carrying accumulated loss, instability, and questions about what comes next. So here's what I want you to take with you tonight. Be careful what decisions you make in survival mode, because what you enter into during survival, you may have to process later. But also understand this. Even if you had to navigate a season imperfectly, God's grace never left you there. And the Bible tells us in Romans 8:28 that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. That doesn't mean every decision was right, but it does mean God is still able to work it together for good. The power in this story is not that everything was done right, but that God remained faithful anyhow. All right, that's where we're going to pause tonight. Next time, we'll talk about what happens when Naomi hears that God has moved again.